Chasing Lights. So I've been having a lot of conversations in the last couple of weeks, especially after the most recent conversation with Josh Harris around this dichotomy. I'd argue it's a false dichotomy between the city and everything else. So there's a tendency, whether it's through political rhetoric or it's just cultural, where people are saying, well, the city and the country are different, and the people are different in both. So a lot of people have, we'll talk about stories about how someone doesn't know their neighbors when they live in an apartment building with hundreds of other people, and say, well, that's proof that in the city everyone's isolated and no one knows their neighbor, and that in the country everyone knows their neighbor and is helping out and everyone's kind and wonderful and everyone looks out for each other. They also say the difference between the people in the city don't understand all the things that go towards making their lives good. Whether it's what they eat or the products they use or the machines they use, they don't know how to use it because they're thought workers or they're the white collar and they never touch it. And then in the country, everyone knows how to repair a small engine. Again, both cases I think are an overstatement, and to a certain extent are also kind of untrue. And so the more I talk to people that have had a chasing lights experience in their life, in other words, they've been in different places, they've had different cultures, they've had to step into different cultures, have a different view on this, and are perhaps not as black and white around the city versus everyone else. So I'm really lucky today to have a good friend, Zeb Bradford, who's the in work life he's the chief investment officer at Metzler Real Estate, but in real life he's someone who has lived in a lot of different cultures throughout his life. And I think in a lot of ways, I'm looking forward to the book that you write, Zeb,
Mhm.
about your chasing lights experience. So thank you for joining me on the conversation.
Well, Gunnar, it's great to be here. And I've really enjoyed both the podcast for Chasing Lights, and I'm looking very much forward to the book. I Learning about your growing up experiences in Alaska was fascinating. And I never would have believed that you had grown up in such a small place. So I'm glad to be here. Very interesting to talk about this topic and many others, I hope.
Excellent. Well, and I love that you call it a small place. Given that Alaska is as wide as the United
Oh,
States,
God,
it's
yeah.
it's a pretty big place in a lot of ways.
Mhm,
But you're right; it's small in terms of just the number of people that are around.
mhm.
And in Alaska terms, I grew up mostly in Anchorage, which was the big city.
Right.
So a lot of folks in Alaska would refer to me as a city kid, even
Right.
though
Mhm,
we had a place in the bush, and I spent a lot of time in the bush every
mhm.
summer. But at the end of the day, I was the city kid. And of course, when I moved to the rest of the United States and spent time traveling around the world, I'm the hick at the end of the day. So it's interesting how it's all relative. It
Right.
depends on where it goes. But you've had that experience as well. You've lived in a lot of different places.
Yeah.
You lived in a military family. So, even
Mhm.
as a kid, you were moving around quite a bit.
Um,
Give me a sense of, all right, so where are you from?
we probably moved every year and a half on average. And from the moment I was born, I grew up actually, I was born in Georgia, close to Atlanta, where I'm living now, in at a military base called Fort Benning, which is sort of probably the largest infantry base in the country, where they have jump school and things like that. And my mom is from Munich, so I spent time growing up there. When my dad was in Vietnam, we lived there, and then after high school, I lived there for a year um, before going to college, and I spent many a summer there too. But so growing up, it was constantly moving and to very, very different places. Um, for example, I went to three high schools, and the first high school was we were back here in Columbus, Georgia, at Fort Benning, and I went to a small private high school, which because the schools in Columbus itself weren't very good. So my parents sent me to a private high school. There were two private high schools in Columbus. There was a Catholic school. We weren't Catholic, and this school. And, the kids were nice. For Columbus, kind of, it was the elite. And, then going from Columbus, Georgia, we moved to truly the backwoods of Louisiana to a military base called Fort Polk, which even in the military they look as being sent to exile. And Fort Polk is a very important military base, but it's in the middle of the state on the border of Texas, where we used to have to drive an hour or so to go see a first run movie. Yeah, and or to go to a mall or anything like that. And I remember when they opened a McDonald's, it was a big deal. I mean, a big deal. And and then going from there to Langley High School in McLean, Virginia, where my classmates were senators' kids and that kind of stuff. So, just that high school period, there was a lot of change, a lot of very different environments and social environments. And, what you learn is generally is that people are the same no matter where they are, and they're good and bad. And it just, the clothes they wear or the cars they drive is the only difference, really. So,
Right. Right. Well, we were having this conversation
yeah.
a couple weeks ago about cars in
Mhm.
particular and about how no matter where you are socioeconomically or where you are geography wise, that there's
Oh
a pecking
man,
order,
there
if you
is.
will, to the cars you drive, the
Oh yeah,
clothes you wear. It's just slightly different what they
yeah,
are. So, the brands might be
yeah.
different, but it's the same idea that the cool kids are
Oh
going to do
yeah,
X and the rest of us are not going to be quite as
yeah.
cool as you are.
And being in the military, we didn't have any money. So
Right.
there were no cars.
Right.
And stuff like that.
But yeah, that would mean that if you were an hour from anything as a kid, you were pretty isolated. It wasn't like, there were a bunch of cars to get you
Yep,
that hour
yep.
away. How often were you able to get to the mall? What was
Well,
that like?
so we were able to borrow our parents' car pretty much, and the lucky thing in Louisiana at the time was you could be 15 and get a license. So yeah, so
Oh,
we were, as soon as we could, you know, get a parent's car. Um,
yeah.
and on these little military bases, you'd always have what they would call a mall, the PX, which is like a
Yeah.
department store kind of, a bowling
Right.
alley, a gym with a basketball court, and there'd be a movie theater, but you generally wouldn't get first run movies. But that was kind of
Right.
it in your little world, and it was a great world, right? Everybody knew each other. There was a pecking order there too, in regards to rank
Yeah.
from the terms of the parents. You had the officers and the NCOs, but everyone generally got along.
So the kids were aware of that and were lining up around that same
Yeah,
pecking
sort
order?
of. I mean, not yes and no. I mean, if your father was an NCO versus an officer, you didn't have a really you were not well off. Officers in that world were well off. Um, and but the kinds of things that people competed on, or the pecking order at schools, weren't really clothes and things like that, and money, because there wasn't really a lot of money. It was sports and the cool factor. So sports was a big deal, and yeah, but it wasn't as bad as, say, for example, in McLean, where you truly had extremely wealthy folks all the way down to not very. So you didn't really have that huge band of income difference in military, in a military on a military base. But it's interesting though, because I've recently had to go back to military bases, and my father's buried at Arlington, and I remember I had a reception at the officers club there for my dad, and had all his West Point classmates come, and I remember going to the officers club when I was a kid. The officers club was this big deal. It was like a country club to us. And and also the quarters that people, especially the officers and the general officers, lived in were, they were really great places. And when I go back, I remember going to that officers club. It looked kind of run down, and it looked, shabby is not the right word, but it just, it was nothing like what I remembered as a kid. But of course, I didn't know what to look for as a kid. I didn't have any benchmark. So to me, that was a country club. And it's kind of eye opening when you go back to these places to realize kind of that's probably what it was like then too. Um, and the same has been for military housing, where I've had the opportunity to go into military housing, even into kind of officers' quarters now. And you realize, first, we need to be paying these people much more than they're getting paid. Yeah, and they, all that they give and the sacrifice they make, they need to be treated very well. But you again see that comp. I thought I lived in a palace when I was a kid, and my dad wasn't a general when I was a little kid. We became one later. But uh, it's interesting to see how you remember things and how they probably truly were.
Well, and it's funny how quickly we
Mhm.
acclimate to kind of different economic
Right.
levels. Where, to a certain extent, you and I have been fortunate enough to have pretty good lives
Yeah.
economically. And yet there's still this sense of, oh, there's something more
Right.
that I have to reach for.
Bigger,
There's
better.
always kind of
Yeah.
that. And it doesn't matter where
Right.
you are on that. But I love the kind of the contrast between the specialness
Mm.
that you saw when
Yep.
you were a kid of the officers' quarters and what it meant to be part of the
Yep.
officer corps, and perhaps what it feels like today as a successful leader, as a non-military person, interacting with that. I think it's fascinating. It's also fascinating the separateness of the military
Yeah.
culture.
Mhm.
So to a certain extent, I think a lot of these bases seem to be isolated. They seem to be
Yep.
in small towns that are not all of them, obviously, but that are isolated from the places where they were. And certainly Alaska is a
Mhm.
big military state, and it's one of the major
Yep.
employers. I think the majority employment in Alaska is government, and that mostly means military, or at least it did during the 70s and 80s. And yet it was separate. If you were a civilian, you didn't go on base, unless you were invited to something special. And it was almost like these two societies. How much did you feel like you were in Louisiana?
After middle school, and in some cases middle school, you had to go off base for your schooling. So you would immediately get that. And so again, pre in elementary school and like you didn't, you're too young to know anything anyway. But yeah, you were engaged pretty quickly with the outside world. In many cases, though, as you kind of alluded to, in the army, especially because what the army typically needs is lots of land, a lot of cheap land, and that means these southern states where they have these huge swaths of military bases, and so those towns that you're nearby generally are living off the base, like Columbus in Georgia, although they have a financial industry there in Columbus, and there's a lot going on. But the military base is quite big. In Louisiana, at Fort Polk, it was a little town called Leesville, and Leesville lived off that base, right? Um, so you were generally pretty integrated, and the kids that didn't have military families were a bit different, but not much. Occasionally you'd have a wealthy family, but you know, comparatively to what you and I kind of see today, maybe they owned a family owned a car lot or a McDonald's franchise, right? That big money in a little place like that.
But it's funny in smaller towns back in the 70s, McDonald's was a big deal.
Mhm.
I remember it being so important that we had a
Oh
McDonald's
wow,
in Alaska,
yeah.
and very proud of the fact that at one point we were the highest throughput for the entire McDonald's system at
Wow,
one point in Anchorage.
that's
It,
great.
it was a
Right.
it was a big
Oh, yeah.
deal, and to a certain extent, I remember all the different that we didn't have a lot of chains that came up, but whenever a chain did open, again to a 12-year-old, it's like this is
I
awesome. I
know.
mean, this is exactly what we need, and I think it's interesting you had the same experience
Oh, yeah.
with that.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of people that talk about, and I think it's to a certain extent a cliche and an annoying one sometimes as well, where people or annoying to me, where people have said, well, it's important to travel for broadening
Mhm.
of your
Yep.
viewpoint. And I agree generally that that's absolutely important. And I've been lucky enough to be in
Mhm.
so many different places throughout my life. But at the same time, the way most people travel is avoiding
Mhm.
actually being in a different place.
Right.
That to a certain extent, a lot of travel is designed to keep you in your bubble wherever
Mhm.
you go.
That's right.
That certainly a lot of business travel, you're staying at exactly the same hotel no matter where you are in the world. You're to a certain extent, maybe the military to a certain extent creates its own corporate bubble.
Mhm.
Even if you're in Germany or you're in Vietnam, that there are similar. You have these cultural touchstones that keep you protected. You can still get a McDonald's burger
Oh, yeah.
in Iraq. I mean, it was an interesting thing that you had all these things that were kind of connecting you to home that you weren't experiencing necessarily the landscape. What is the difference in your mind between travel for travel's sake? And I worry that a lot of people just travel to, I don't know, get the miles, or what is it about? I mean, you really traveled. You were in these
Oh,
places
yeah.
for longer than a 3-day tour. You were there,
Mhm.
and what is the difference in your mind?
Well, I mean, first, let's separate living someplace and living someplace that's not connected to, uh, like being on a military base, for example,
Right.
with travel. Travel today, I mean, first, it's great. I mean, people are seeing the world. That's fantastic,
Yeah.
right? And but they're very curated little trips, right? So people are
Mhm.
going to like everyone's going to Japan today, which is great. I mean, Japan's
Oh,
fantastic,
it's awesome. Yeah.
but they're going to Tokyo and Kyoto and maybe Hokkaido for skiing. But they're very, most people, 90%, are going to these specific places. They're having the same experiences as other travelers in Instagrammable backgrounds,
Yeah.
and they're going on whatever social media that they're going on or travel site, and they're visiting the same places because they're all
Right.
ranked, and have
Yeah.
reviews that they add a review to, and
Yeah.
so it's a little superficial and a little unreal. Now there
Mhm.
are that 10% that go the extra mile and really, get a backpack on or, really head to the, places that people don't typically go to. But most people, because they have a limited amount of time and they want to make sure that they have a fun time. So I get it.
Right.
But that's very different. That's a great thing.
Yeah.
It's a good thing. It's always good to have cultural exchange. It's good to see other you do get an experience of a foreign culture, but it's a very superficial view.
Yeah. And it feels like a notch on the belt. It's like, okay, I've
Correct.
done that. Check that box.
Exactly.
I went to Tokyo, I
Yep.
went to
Yep.
Kyoto, and
Yep.
maybe I have a good story to tell and an awesome photograph to share on social media. But
Right.
that seems to be the point at this point.
Yeah. And then living someplace is very different. And
Hmm.
when, like, for example, when I was a kid, we lived in Munich for a year and a half when my dad was in Vietnam. We did, we lived in Munich. We had an apartment,
Yeah.
and we ran around speaking German, going to German shops.
Yeah.
I mean, it was completely, and after high school, again, I lived with my relatives right outside of Munich in a little kind of right at the edge of the ring road. Um, and again, it was not, I didn't have any Americans in my life. Um,
Right.
and then I lived in Russia for 5 years, 2.5 in Moscow, 2.5 in St. Petersburg. And again, there were plenty of expats, but it was, I mean, when you're in some place for longer than a week or two, you get kind of deep, and and you get to see, you interact constantly. For example, my wife's from Russia. We met there.
Right.
We've been together, married for 27. We were together for 3 years. So there,
Fantastic.
and so you really get to know a place, the good and the bad, and there's always
Right.
bad along with the good,
Yeah.
no matter where you are. So I think that's a big difference, and you truly do get to know a place. One thing to never forget, though, is that you're not a native of that place. And
Yeah.
I, as you are too, I know, is that you're very interested in politics and geopolitics. And so you can have an opinion about a place and the politics of a place, but never forget you are a foreigner there. And the natives can get very upset with a foreigner's opinion of their internal politics. And so you're closer to being a native than a tourist, but you're not a native. And
Right.
sometimes people forget that. I did at times. And
Well, it's almost, it's a necessary, what's the word I'm looking for? It's almost a necessary medicine for us to constantly be reminded
yeah,
of the importance of humility
right.
and
Yeah.
that we don't have the
Oh
answers
yeah.
ever. I don't care how smart you are or how
Yeah.
well read you are. We don't have all the answers, and we have to be open. We have to be listening to others. The experience of being a foreigner, or the feeling of being a foreigner, I think is valuable. It's
Yeah.
helpful. I think it's helpful for anyone that has to interact with other
Yeah.
people, and potentially even in leadership positions, especially to understand you are not able to assume.
Yeah.
You're not able to say this is the way it
Right.
is because you don't know. You're not a native,
Right.
and to a certain extent, what are you a native of, Zeb?
Yeah.
Where are you not a foreigner?
Right. I know. And things are so politicized even internally in these countries, in all countries today,
Yeah.
that you're going to hit a tripwire someplace. So just to have you had the right word. You have the humility to know that you don't know everything, and
Mhm.
it's so easy to kind of spout off. For example, I would say negative things about Putin, and
Right.
what you forget is 70% of Russians approve of him.
Yeah.
And okay, well, of course, I think I'm right, but I mean,
Well,
humility is a good thing, right?
yeah.
Um,
Well, and giving you a reason to try to put yourself in their
yeah,
shoes, if you will, and
right,
understand what's the context for why they see things the way they do. A wonderful historian that I sat down with recently kept saying, if you understand the context of their history, how they look at
yeah,
history, whoever they
yeah,
is, you can actually do a better job of predicting their behavior going forward because you understand the context of
right,
why.
yep,
And this idea that there's more than one history, that it depends on
that's right.
what their
Their
experience
perspective,
is, what
yeah,
their narratives
mhm,
are, what their story is. That wow, what a valuable experience or a valuable reminder constantly. If you are a foreigner,
yep,
if you feel like you don't belong there, now we tend to look at that as negative. I don't feel like I belong. How awful! And sometimes that can feel alienating and lonely and
mhm,
everything else. But it also, wow, what an incredible tool to have something that's reminding you that, well, the reality kind of depends on what the narrative is, what the context is.
yep,
Even if you're agreeing on the facts, which is not something that always happens, but even if you're agreeing on the facts, the context can change what it means and where it goes, and having stretching that muscle.
yep,
I feel like spending a childhood being a foreigner means that you're stretching,
mhm,
you're building it up. You've done the bodybuilding around, how do you see what other people think and how they feel? Would
right,
you agree?
absolutely. And that so my entire life was like that, where I'd go from one culture, even here in the US, to another,
Hmm.
and you'd have to adapt, or be very lonely. You have to adapt and understand where people are coming from, what's important to them, um, and try to find some commonality. Um, Again, because if you didn't, you just were very isolated. And I think what you find is that people are generally there's a lot of commonality amongst people no matter what the culture is. People love their
Right.
children. They want the best for themselves. They're generally very kind and nice. Most people,
Mhm.
on
Mhm.
on the margins, you have people that aren't, but generally,
Right.
and so as long as you can find that commonality and not be and have some humility, you can get along just fine with most people and
Right.
and thrive in a different culture.
Mhm.
But it is at first it's a little bit when you first kind of plunge in the water there, you getting your bearings can take a little time. And
And especially when you're a kid
yeah,
and you're growing up and an adolescent, it's tough. You don't
yeah,
have all the context to be able to do that, and the feelings can be intense.
there's
Um,
yeah. So,
I
some
mean,
kids
I
never
think
made it, right?
lone
So
right.
I I'm a pretty outgoing guy, and and my I have one sister that wasn't so much so, and
Mhm.
all that moving I think really damaged her, where it's stilted her sort of growth and made her more introverted. And that wasn't uncommon amongst military families where you had one child that just couldn't adapt that quickly and so
Right.
became, very introverted. And that
Mhm.
kind of happened to one of my sisters, which I've always felt very, very badly about.
It's hard. I mean, I think people require different environments
Mhm.
sometimes, and sometimes not everyone gets the environment that is best for
Right.
them, on a go forward
Yeah.
basis. So it can be tough. I mean, there's part of me that one of the conversations that a lot of people are having right now is around isolation,
Mhm.
loneliness, and certainly this has been
Mm.
a big conversation
Yeah.
for the last, I don't know, 100 years.
Yeah.
Modern civilization. Are we connecting enough to each other?
Yeah.
And we tend to look at those feelings as universally negative, right? So loneliness is a bad thing.
Mhm.
Boredom is a bad thing. We worry that our kids are bored and they're not being stimulated enough. And so
Mhm.
we do everything we can to try to give them stimulation. And yet, I wonder, as I look at my own life, I look at some of the positives, incredible positives that have come out of going through periods of loneliness,
Mhm.
through periods of boredom, even through periods of depression, which frankly, depression is just it's awful, and it's something that cannot be overstated as being a dangerous and difficult place to
Mhm.
be emotionally. All of these are related. Certainly, these are those sticky, ugly, bad feelings that we have that lead to sometimes some very negative behaviors and negative outcomes, but also can help us grow.
Right.
So that's a long
Yeah.
preamble to try to provoke you to talk a little bit about how important was loneliness for you
Mm.
to figure out how to become who you are?
Mm. So, wow. You know, there weren't many times in my life that I was lonely just because of my personality. So
Okay.
we very close family because all the moving, you became that was the unit of society that would never changed. And so we were all very, very close. In school, I was generally pretty outgoing. So I generally always had friends. Um, and there were one or two times when that didn't happen. And the good thing about moving every year and a half is that you're going to move in a year and a half, so you're going to be out of there anyway. So
So you get a
that's
do-over every
right,
year and a
right,
half. That's
right.
fantastic. Yeah.
And so that was kind of a good thing. But going back to what you'd mentioned, the world that you and I grew up in is extremely different from the world that kids are growing up in today. And I'd recommend reading Jonathan Haidt's books. He's had a couple in the past 4 or 5 years about
Mhm.
one is the loneliness and introversion amongst children caused primarily by social media and the internet. And
Mhm.
chart after chart after chart of a hockey stick of mental challenges for kids, not only in the US. I mean, again, it's his cohort was primarily English speaking countries, so Canada, England, New Zealand, Australia, just because there was better data, I think. But what those kids are going through is numbing to watch.
Yeah.
And layer on AI today, and I think we've all read some of the stories about these poor kids that get AI friends that kind of lead them
Yeah.
down a path to
Yeah.
suicide in some cases.
Yeah.
And so I and the again, the extent of mental illness that all of this is causing is really just a shame. And again, it's not something that you and I grew up with. So it's thank God. It is heartbreaking to see, and that is something that society absolutely needs to figure out, because
Mhm.
otherwise entire swaths of our young people are
Yeah.
becoming mentally challenged. I
Right.
really worry about that.
I do too. I think it's difficult, but it does weirdly remind me of some of the concern that was expressed when we were kids. So we're generally around the same age. So we're growing up in the 70s
Yep.
and the early 80s.
Yep.
And there were two terrible things that people worried about. One is that we watched too much television,
Right.
and certainly that's true.
Yep.
We watched too much television. Number two, that we spent too much time in malls.
Mm. Right.
So the malls had become kind of the town square,
Right.
a lot more controlled and artificial, but it was where we hung out because it was the place where we could accidentally bump into someone. We could maybe see the girl of our dreams.
Right.
We could have that social experience that's in person.
Yep.
So, okay, so we watched too much television, and yet television, especially for those of us that were perhaps not in New York City or Arlington, Virginia, or any of these places where things happen, was a connection to a world
Right.
of experience
Yep.
and culture. And a lot of it was bad because a lot of world culture is junk,
Mhm.
obviously.
Yeah.
But a lot of it was very important as well,
Mhm.
and was very, in some ways, even though you and I were far flung, we were so connected to New York and Los Angeles throughout our childhood.
Yep.
We knew what was going on in a funny, even if we didn't know specifically, we were constantly being fed that information. And
Yeah.
it's part of what shaped us for good and for ill, both. So television, not a universal evil,
Right.
but certainly if you're spending all your time watching television, you're going to be isolated. You're not going to be there with friends.
Yep.
You're not going to make those connections and have those social experiences. Shopping malls, not the best. I mean, a
Mhm.
lot of the malls of the 70s and 80s are dead now, and there's a reason for it. They're not really, they weren't the best spaces
Mhm.
in the world, but they were what we had.
Right.
The, so when we think about what's happening with AI and social media and kind of this isolation of kids, it is terrible, and they're having a hard time. And the worst cases are terrifying in terms of people completely pulling out of society and
Mhm.
having all the problems from it. But is the answer to say you can't have any of that? Generally speaking, when we tell people you can't do something, it doesn't end well.
Right.
Every time we've tried prohibition, it gets tricky. Um, Instead, what are the things that can help them get what they're looking for? So people spending hours and hours and hours on social media means they're looking for something
Mhm.
and they're probably not getting it. So how do we help them find what they're looking for is, I think, the question. And how do we as a society adapt to new media? Now,
Mm.
every time new media has been created, it has led or been a contributor to significant social conflict.
Mhm.
So think about the Gutenberg Bible.
Mhm.
Yeah, you learned how to cheaply produce Bibles, but you also learned how to create leaflets that people would nail to the church door and would get everyone angry and lead to civil and violent conflict
Mhm.
throughout Western Europe for 100 years. Yeah, radio and television and newspapers, amazing.
Mhm.
But how much did they create strife that maybe wasn't there before? How much did it create new narratives that perhaps were not as positive as the narratives were there before? And it took a while for us to adapt as a society to those new medias. You know, our ability to watch a commercial today is based on years and years of people believing everything they heard in a commercial. Well,
Right.
of course I need antiperspirant.
Mhm.
The whole world changed in great part because of advertising that we believed.
Mhm.
Now we don't. Now we have to be entertained
Yep.
like crazy in order for an ad to actually work. Well, social media has been doing the same thing. We've been watching in real time people believing what they read or see on social media and on the internet as being absolute truth
Yep.
without having that skepticism built in. We haven't learned how to read it or how to watch it. We're getting better at it, but it seems like the media is evolving faster than we can adapt to it. There's no doubt in my mind we will adapt to it. We will be able to figure out the difference between an AI bot and a real human connection. How do we? It seems to me the question should be, how do we get there faster? How do we help our kids now get beyond it and find something that's more valuable?
You kind of hit the nail on the head there in terms of the speed, right? You've had over time, technology used to take decades, if not a century, to diffuse itself and to be established. Today, it happens in a nanosecond, it seems. And so the ability to keep up, the ability to recognize danger, the ability to adapt is almost impossible for a human. Second is the ability, well, many of those media were also, there was, they were, it was common to all. And so you and I remember when there were three television stations, right? And then cable came, and then it was hundreds. Well, could you even put a number on how many different ways to access content on the internet? I've got to say it's nearly infinite. And then facing the other side of the screen, a newspaper is published, a radio or television program is published, and it's outward facing. Here, it's a two-way street now, where on the other side, you've got an algorithm that is searching for ways to dig you deeper. And so for an adolescent mind, I mean, that must be putty in the hands of these people. I mean, it's so easy to manipulate. So, it's a very different type of media now. It's much more nefarious. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And so, is the answer, you know, better regulation? Probably, right? I mean, if you look at, and I truly hate to use China as an example because I look at the system there and it frightens me. But if you look at, you got TikTok here and you have TikTok there. They're completely different, right? And so their version that they allow their people to access, um, I think has a lot more guardrails to it. Here, I think they're happy that we don't have guardrails because they're driving us down, right? So, but maybe that's the way. But we like to believe in free speech and those kinds of things. But again, I think the media now it's a different ballgame. It really is.
Actually, interaction with individuals creates chemical reactions in the brain.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
we get the pleasure centers get
Yeah.
hit. Just the fact that you and I are talking to each
Yeah.
other, it's pleasurable for us. It's something that we reach for. It's part of humans, operating system.
Yeah.
And, we've had this issue with a lot of things where it took us a while to figure out that what we were doing was too much, that it was more than the
Yeah.
system could handle. So, up until very recently, this idea that too much sugar was dangerous, it really wasn't baked into our collective understanding.
Right.
What's wrong with having more sugar? It's sweet. It's wonderful. I mean, I've seen ads from the 50s and 60s that, were encouraging people to have a spoonful of sugar before they had dinner so that
Right.
they didn't eat as much,
Right.
and,
Wow.
and I
Yeah.
think there was this, and part of it was coming certainly from a commercial interest, which was, the more sugar I can sell, the better I'm going to be. But it wasn't totally nefarious. I think there was a general feeling of, hey, I love this stuff. This is
Right.
great. It feels good. It's tasty. It's calories, and up until our lifetimes, there was always a fight for more calories for a lot of people. So it seemed like a cheap and easy way to fulfill those issues, and it makes you happy. Makes you happy for a while until it doesn't. And understanding, and here's something that there's nothing wrong inherently with sugar. I'm not of the belief that all sugar is bad. It would be hard for me to give up a chocolate croissant.
Mhm.
They're awfully wonderful, but at the same time, too much of it is a problem.
Right.
So finding that balance is difficult. I would argue that seeing a funny video of AI generated cute bunnies and cats and whatever it is that they're doing, I don't think it inherently is bad. It fulfills a desire. But if that's all you're doing, if you're watching that round the clock, if every time you have a moment, you're popping open your TikTok, that may be too much,
Yeah.
and that may be a problem. The same way that I think a lot of folks that are of our age, had to learn how to manage television. And
Right.
sometimes we're out of whack when we start, streaming, the same series until we finish it, things like that. That's too much.
Yeah.
We know that, and we have to balance that. But I think how do we, and algorithms in of themselves, they are certainly nefarious from the standpoint that their whole point is to get you to watch it more, and it's very successful at that. But there are some positives, certainly. I mean, is a computer program helping me connect to things that I'm most interested in? I think a lot of people would say that's not entirely negative, but it
Absolutely.
has to be balanced.
Right.
How do we balance it? And how do we understand that our buttons are getting pushed? And, it may not be an individual, some evil character that's saying, I'm going to push Zeb and Gunner's button until they can't function anymore. I think it comes from a feeling of this is fun. This is good. This people want to do it. At the same time, we really need to eat less sugar.
Yeah. Mm.
There was a time when cocaine was considered cool enough to put into Coca-Cola. We learned as a society,
Yeah.
probably not a good idea.
Yeah.
Uh, that there are other things we can do that might be less damaging.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what do you think?
Yeah. I'm trying to think. Uh, there was a show that was produced I think about 4 or 5 years ago. It was either called the social media, or it was something that showed the other side of the screen. It was a documentary, actually. And
Yeah.
it interviewed a number of folks from Silicon Valley that said, boy, we don't let our kids on social media. And
Yeah.
they had this one thing where they showed a kid dangling on puppet strings, and he kind of went off social media. And the other side, there was a guy going, hey, wait a minute. He stopped. He stopped. Okay, what can we do to kind of get him engaged again? Again, there
Hmm.
isn't a guy, there's an algorithm that
Hmm.
sees less activity, and it's targeted directly to that individual. How do I get that individual, based upon all my knowledge of him, to start engaging again? So
Hmm.
that's how do you combat that? I think probably through regulation. I mean, there's got to be a way, right? Um, I don't think the social media companies are probably the right people to provide comment on that, because they're motivated to
Yeah.
make as much money as they can. But I think there's probably some great Democrats and Republicans that share our concerns, and could find a way to lessen that. I don't know how to do that, from a technological perspective.
And I don't know if it's a technological fix. I mean, we're really talking about the sticky and difficult and
Yep.
clumsy part of how does a human society educate itself, inoculate itself, become wary
Mhm.
of where the dangers are. As human beings, we tend to have to really screw up a lot before we fix something.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think that's part of what's happening right now is that we are dealing with things that are far more powerful than we realize.
Yep.
And we talk about it changing the world and the economic opportunity of all these things, and I think to a certain extent we overstate sometimes with new tech.
Mhm.
but we don't understand where the actual power is and where the danger is until we've lived with it for a while,
Mhm.
and we've made a lot of mistakes before we kind of get there. Unfortunately, and all I want to do is get us through the mistake period as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
But I do think it's interesting that I remember when my daughter was younger, there were quite often lessons that she was getting in school about how to consume commercials, how to understand media, understand why things are the way they are. I remember even before that, seeing these kinds of discussions
Mhm.
being part of how we talk about how we do this. I think it's interesting that we had a television series called Mad Men that was all about advertising in the '60s, and to a certain extent, we all found it kind of quaint. But
Mhm.
they discovered an incredible power to influence
Right.
in order to sell products, which again, this was to help build companies to do things that are not entirely negative. It created jobs, it created new products, everything else that people valued. But in the process of figuring out, well, whatever it takes to sell, I'm going to do. As soon as you become single minded, and an algorithm is about as single minded as we can create,
Mhm.
it's very easy to miss the forest for the trees. And I think that's part of where we're sitting right now. And again, I don't think it's simply making sure that everyone takes a class on how to use social media safely and responsibly. I don't think that'll do it in of itself. But I do think there's a when or how do we help trigger the cultural change where we go, oh, wait a minute, this is not what I want.
Mhm.
I mean, I think it's important to realize that no one signs up to become a heroin addict.
Right.
That's not how you get there.
Right.
You don't, you don't say, today I'm going to become a heroin addict. That's not how people get there. They get there because they're trying to solve an immediate
Mhm.
problem or an immediate need, whatever it is.
Right.
And we can argue whether or not that's a good or bad thing, but people are doing something for a
Yep.
reason, and human beings act that way. Does someone spend does someone intend to spend 8 hours a day watching TikTok videos? I don't think
I
so.
don't think so.
I don't think that's the
Yep.
intent. I just think that one TikTok video is fun, kind of, but not enough. And so you go deeper and you go deeper, and you go
Yep.
deeper. So that's yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say it's like taking heroin. That's an
Mhm.
extreme, but it is a similar
Yep.
mechanism in terms of how we get into it, and understanding it, and not necessarily saying this is good or bad. I think we get into trouble when we say this is good, that is bad.
Mhm.
As soon as we get into that realm, it's very hard for us to think
Right.
rationally and actually solve a
Yep.
problem. Um, so I mean, I think we have to start taking this seriously from a standpoint of, is this what you want? Mr. or Mrs. 13-year-old, is this really what you want? If it's not what you want, then how do we get you to another place where you're getting what you want and what you need? And I think everyone who's lonely,
Mhm.
everyone who's isolated, at least based on my own experience as someone who's been lonely, has been isolated, has been depressed, what is it that you're looking for?
Right.
And can we help that person find what they're looking
Mhm.
for? And I don't know the answer to that. I think
Wow.
it's a tough answer,
Yep.
but there must be a way. We've done it before.
Yep. Well, yeah, I mean, that's a societal issue. And unfortunately, uh, our political system doesn't seem to be in the business of solving problems these days.
Yeah. No.
It seems to be more fighting and outdoing each other. So, another thing that I've also noticed is the rise of therapy and how people are turning more and more to therapy, which I think is very helpful
Yeah.
to break out of those problems, the depression, loneliness, and so I think that is one way that society is kind of fulfilling that. There are more therapists today, thank God,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so that may be one way that uh, for for some people to find a solution. It's
Right.
again not cheap, and you would hope that insurance will pay for that. I think most people who have insurance are able to get therapy, but there's I think plenty of folks that should be in therapy that don't uh,
Yeah.
go to therapy. Um, I'd be very interested to hear your take on AI and what its implications are. Just recently, and I'm lumping in a lot of this autonomous vehicles and all that with AI. they've just started having these Waymo cars driving around Atlanta, and I
Hmm.
take Uber quite a bit. So my conversations for the past couple of weeks here in Atlanta with Uber drivers is, well, what do you think about Waymo? They all think it's a plot by Uber to replace all the drivers with machines so they don't have to pay the drivers
Right.
anymore. And
Hmm.
and you think about all the different industries where that's probably going to be the case. I'm really worried about society um, over the next 10 years when all of these, you know, jobs that can be automated will be automated.
Hmm.
Drivers, cashiers, just even analysts. I mean, we see that in the real estate market. You've already
Yeah.
seen, just in the past month, you've seen a number of articles in the Journal and the New York Times and Financial Times about, guess what? Entry level financial jobs are being replaced by AI. It's
Right.
harder to get a job with uh, a undergraduate degree today. There's a higher
Hmm.
unemployment rate for undergraduate degrees come right
Yep.
coming out of school than high school degrees.
Hmm.
It's really it's going to be a big, the next 10 years is going to be very interesting to watch. And how do you see that changing society? I mean, to me, that's a real head scratcher. I'm on what to do about it,
Yeah.
but just understanding how far it's going to go.
Well, I think first off, we've got to get to a point where we understand that we're approaching crisis. We've got to be able to look at it, and I think that's a process we're going through right now. We're figuring out. Wait a minute, this is a
Yep.
problem, and it's not just a problem of getting a job when you have no experience, and this is your ladder that we've done in the past. How are we going to develop talent going forward? How are we going to staff at a senior level if you don't have people coming in, because that's traditionally
Right.
how we've done it. We've just done
Yep.
it that way, and no one's questioned if there's another way to do it, but that is the way we do it. I do think that every time we've seen historically a dramatic shift in employment, what it is that people do, it does lend itself to a lot of social strife. It does get it's a crisis. It's something where we don't know what to do. And I mean, certainly the argument is always made that we end up with more jobs after we get through this
Mhm.
than we had before. But that's a lot of people that have to change their life.
Yep.
And, change is easy to talk about. It's
Yep.
hard to do.
Yep.
And the details of, well, first of all, these recent college graduates that, have been studying for a certain kind of economy that doesn't exist anymore, a certain kind of job market that doesn't exist anymore. Um, Now what do they do? How are they going to get themselves positioned for the next gig that is going to allow them to support
Yeah.
themselves? Or how about someone who's been working as an Uber driver that suddenly, if tomorrow there's no longer an Uber driver,
Yes,
that's
you
been an
do.
incredible
Yeah.
economic engine for a lot of
Yep.
people. What do they do? How do they move to the next thing? And again, that's
Is there a next thing?
scary and
Yeah.
hard. And you're going to see a lot of people that maybe never thought that their jobs were under threat. They thought that it was going to be this way forever. And it's not. It's
Yep.
it's changing very, very quickly. And all of us, I don't care what position you have, we're all kind of facing some existential
Mhm.
questions about, can I continue doing what I
Yeah.
have been doing? And how do I shift? And how do I pivot to that new?
Yeah.
So I think it's a crisis, and I don't think crisis is necessarily all
Mhm.
bad. It is, and I don't want to dismiss how difficult it is and how painful and how much suffering comes from crises. A lot of suffering, but it also is a point in time where we can create something better.
Mhm.
And I think part of what is hard in politics, because the politicians at the end of the day are serving, maintaining what is,
Right.
that's their job,
Right.
to
Yeah.
a certain extent, maintaining what is. And so much of what is not serving
Right.
us, that there are things where it's missing.
Yep.
And for all the success that you and I have seen in our lifetimes in the Western world, there's been amazing things. I mean, we've reduced poverty, we've increased literacy around the world. You and I didn't do it, but it's been part of the world that we've known. That we've actually, in some ways, seen more peace than any other epoch in history. And I love how people complain about how everyone in the United States is weak because they've never known terrible strife. And I'm like, and that's a
That's
bad
a
thing.
bad thing.
It's a bad
Yeah,
thing that our children have never known
right,
war. And is that a bad thing,
right,
or is that something that allows us maybe to progress in a different way and in a more peaceful way potentially? Yeah, there's lessons that we're going to have to learn as things get harder, as things get tough, and everyone is going to toughen up. I never worry about people toughening up. It's not like you have to spend your entire life in trauma in order to be
right.
tough. These things, human beings react and respond and change as they go forward. But again, I think there's no doubt in my mind that we are in a period of of of, of dramatic disruption.
Hmm.
And the question is, can we navigate this in a more enlightened way than we have in the past? I don't believe that we have to do what we did in the 1930s and 1940s. I don't think we have to do that.
Hmm.
I don't think we have to go through the extremes that came out of the Industrial Revolution. I don't think we have to hurt people that way and blow up civilization. I think we can do better than that. Now that marks me probably as an idiot and someone that is naive, but it seems to me that at the very least we should try
Hmm.
to do better.
Yeah. Well, I certainly hope so. We were talking about the speed of these revolutions, industrial, digital. This is happening so quickly. And
Hmm.
do people have time to pivot, to, retrain, relearn? I don't know.
Yeah.
The Uber driver, he was in something stable before he became an Uber driver.
Right.
He's already lost that. And so now he's even losing the gig economy, right? So
Right.
that's that's interesting.
Well, it certainly is kind of a proof point that the gig economy is not a panacea.
Right.
And for anyone that's worked, which I
Yeah.
have, in a gig environment, it's stressful. It's hard.
Oh, yeah.
You're constantly in a realm of disruption. The Uber driver is having to deal with market forces on a weekly basis, on a daily basis that maybe they wouldn't have to
Right.
if they had a steady job within a traditional corporation.
Right.
I do wonder what's the job of corporate culture, and certain to a certain extent, we have moved across the board in corporate culture away from you know we are supporting the employee base to succeed, to have a job for life, to have a
Yeah.
pension, to more of, well, everyone's on their own,
Yeah.
and company loyalty is not necessarily something that's universally held as
Yeah.
important anymore,
Yeah.
and nor is loyalty to your employee base. It feels to me like we've been on a pendulum and we've kind of gone pretty far over to one side, which is more, eat what you kill kind of environment, versus an environment that, maybe is more about, developing the right team of people over time, really serving the communities in which you work. I spent 8 years working at General Electric as we were converting from that old world into much more of a piracy
Right.
mode,
Right.
where not no one has stability, no one has security. Certainly mistakes are made on both sides of that spectrum. A job for life for a lot of people is not necessarily a universal
Right.
positive, and a lot of people lose out in that. But an environment where no one is taken care of that way, I think, also creates
Oh,
some
absolutely.
problems.
Yeah. Yeah. We've got to, especially, if you have the kind of layoffs that some predict under AI, um, the recipe for social unrest is so great that there'll have to be some kind of structure put in to
Yeah.
make sure these people are okay. And it won't just be the Uber drivers.
No.
It'll be a lot of society.
No. And I think we've been seeing social unrest already. I mean, 20 years ago, would you have thought that we'd have, a violent, I don't know what to call it anymore, but insurrection on Capitol
Right.
Hill? That seemed
Right.
impossible until it happened.
Yeah.
And I think the people that were involved in that, they saw it as, this is the only way that,
We
in
can be
order
heard.
to achieve their goals, in order to
Yeah.
be heard, they felt that was the only way.
Yeah.
Now, was it the right thing to do? We can argue that all over the place. But the reality is, we have people that are now feeling like they're at a breaking point,
Yeah.
And social unrest is really here. It's not like we're waiting for social unrest to happen. It's already here. The question is, how do we manage it?
Right.
And I do think we can manage it better.
Absolutely.
I think we can, address the concerns that are there,
Yep.
and we can avoid the greatest suffering, which is people dying
Yep.
because of this, or
Yep.
or whole societies falling apart
Yep.
because we haven't managed it. We haven't worked through it.
And what it's really going to take is far better political leadership than we've had.
Yeah.
And, both parties. The reality is in all countries, not just the US, but in all countries, most people are centrist. You know,
Mhm.
70 to 80% of people, they want to wake up, send their kids to school, read about whatever sport they like, go to work, come home at night. They just want to have a good normal life.
Mhm.
And what goes on in whatever capital what country they're in, it seems very remote because you have this political class that seems to live in a different world. And
Yeah.
it
Well, not unlike the teenager on TikTok, anyone that's in the political game is rewarded for more extreme
Right,
positions, right?
absolutely, absolutely,
So you're
yeah,
you're you're getting your little hit of dopamine every
right,
time you are more extreme.
yeah,
You're getting more votes. You're getting
yeah,
more financial support. All those
yeah,
things. So again, I mean, they're good people that work in the political
there
class. They're
are,
doing their best, and I
yeah,
think it's true on all
yeah,
parties and everything else. But they're trapped as well.
yeah,
They're
in
trapped
a
in this
system,
environment where
yeah,
and this context that the centrist position,
yeah,
to your point, a majority of people live there.
yeah,
That's where they live. And yet the narrative right now is that to be centrist is to be weak and
yeah,
apathetic, to not care about wherever the concerns are. And I think that's at the very least an
yeah,
exaggeration, and at worst an absolute falsehood.
yeah,
That people that live in the center care very deeply about what they care about, that it's important to them, but ultimately they want to have a stable
yeah,
life in the middle, and maybe part of what is courageous is to be with someone who irritates the heck out of you and give them a right to exist.
right, yeah, right,
That's courage,
absolutely,
and that's toughness, and I think that we need to start defining that as the ultimate kind of strength and adulthood.
yeah,
That, you disagree with me. You've said something to me that, I just think is awful and, is wrong. And yet, how can I stand with you and be with you even though you irritate me?
yeah. I think
That's
it
tough.
is tough. I do think in both political parties, there are people in the center who, let's hope to God, they rise to the top. I mean,
Yeah.
um, because they're there, and in both
Yeah.
in both parties, uh, you know,
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
I'm hopeful that 2028 will produce that.
Yeah.
Very hopeful.
I do think the whole thing's being shaken up a bit, which happens
Yeah,
on a pretty frequent basis as we go through different administrations. That there's a shakeup, and people are going, "All right, what we did before isn't working, so what do we do now?" I think that I think it's important that we don't over dramatize the experience that we're going through. This is very redolent of what we've done in the
right.
past. We've seen this before. But that being said, I think it's very dramatic what we're going through because every kind of component of the system is
Stress.
is being
Yeah.
questioned and stressed.
Oh,
Whether it's just how we vote,
yeah,
it's fundamental. It's a difference. And even if you don't agree with the left or the right's position on voting, you have to look at it and go, well, it's not working. We're not getting
yeah,
representation that is accurate. So we need to rethink it. What is the system that works? I don't know. There's a lot of good ideas and a lot of bad ideas that people are looking at right now, but that certainly is what we're doing. We're having that conversation now. I think that the technology of communication is a big part of it
mhm,
because what is leadership and politics but a form of communication? And that's, I mean, let's put it this way: Hollywood doesn't know how it works anymore. I mean, we're all kind of looking at how do we communicate to each
yeah,
other. And by the way, what the exercise that you and I are doing right now is a form of that. And the question I think that we need to have there, because certainly the internet has allowed new voices to be heard and to become successful. Are we able to resist the desire to push everyone's buttons and go to something that's maybe a little bit more interesting, a little bit more long term, and a little bit more adult? Can we have a conversation with each other around the world that says, you know what, there's nothing wrong with being here in the center. And in fact, this is the tough position to be in. It's not as sexy, but but my belief is it can be extremely interesting
Mhm.
and very sexy if you're willing to spend a little bit more time.
Yep.
If you're not just going for the headline. I think one of the dangerous things is how short our communication pieces are
Right.
now.
Right. Yeah.
Twitter bothered me from the beginning. It's so
Yep.
short. So it leads you to bumper sticker communication, which is all it does is piss people
Yep.
off
It
and,
gets your
try to
attention.
figure out
Yep.
who your tribe
Yep. That's
is,
right.
you know?
Yep. It is. And, you know, is there time for that anymore? People's lives are so fragmented with obligations and stress itself that do they have time to reflect? Do they have time to discuss? Do they have time to go reach out to someone that they may not agree with to talk?
Mhm.
Because it's going to take that to find that commonality.
Right.
Um, I don't know, but I'm hopeful. Again,
Yeah.
through my travels around the world, I found that most people are good. Most people want the same things generally, and I know people are thirsting for getting back to stability and some kind of normality that we've been lacking for, gosh, about 8 years now. And
Mhm.
we, and it's not as if this is in isolation. There's other things happening around the world which are threatening our own.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
It I I couldn't agree with you
yeah.
more. And I'm very hopeful as well that we can go there. And I think that the strong position today is to be insane enough to say, we can get there. We can do it. Don't know exactly how we do it, but I think it's going to start by saying, all right, there's something to be said for connecting to someone else,
Mhm.
whatever that
Yeah,
is. E.M. Forster, his kind of watchwords were only connect. And it is such a powerful idea if we can connect, if we can take more time. I mean, think about it. People listen to books now on a regular basis. I'm surprised at the amount of people that, they're constantly listening to books. Even if they're driving to work or walking around, that there's a hunger for that style of reflection,
yeah.
for longer forms. I think it's also a positive that the predominant form of entertainment right now is long form.
I did not know that. It's
Well, you think about television series,
mhm.
they're telling stories over not just 2 hours, which is the typical an hour and a half to 2 hours for a movie, to 20 hours or more.
Right,
What do people get all excited about? These kind of constant soap
right,
operas that we're all kind of engaging in, whether it's The Gilded Age, I guess was a
right.
popular show, or, name your favorite
Yeah.
show. That there is an appetite for something that, we worry about shortening of attention spans, and yet people will spend a weekend watching one story.
Mhm, mhm,
And I think that is close to a positive, something that we need. I don't think it's entirely a negative that we are hungering for longer, slower,
mhm.
more detailed reflection on what it means to be alive, to be in a society. I certainly hope, as someone who's publishing a book that's reflective over time and about time, that there is an appetite for that.
Mhm,
And the question is, how do we collectively embrace that even further? How do we think about it's not just watching, some, cool new show that came out on Netflix or something. But how do we do that in our life?
mhm.
How do we spend more time? The time is there. Certainly, if you're spending 8 hours looking at TikTok, there is time. You just have to make some choices. What do you want to spend
Yeah.
time with? Um, I think it's hard because it's so easy to distract. I'm very easily distracted. I feel sometimes like the cat with a laser pointer. You know, oh, look at that! You know,
Mhm.
that's interesting. Um, but I do think that the rewards are so much greater for reflection. Well, we've spent over an hour talking, and I want to be respectful of other people's time
Mm,
if anyone does listen to this, and I'm so glad that some people are, and I'm very glad that you spent the time with me, Zeb, to talk a little bit. And again, I'm looking forward to your memoirs
mm.
because I think there's a lot of stories there. And certainly you have seen the world in your lifetime, and you have lived in places. You didn't just take the Four Seasons tour of the world. You actually lived there and you spent time there. And I think that's something we need to all learn from. So thank you, Zeb, for talking with me.
Absolutely, Gunnar. And I really appreciate both your friendship, but also your authorship. I've really enjoyed your writings and your podcasts. And please keep up all the great work. We need you, and we need more of this. So thank you very much.
Chasing lights.